Hello, everyone. It is Wednesday, I think, right? Oh, God, I'm blanking in the first sentence. It is Wednesday, and it is time for another community hangout here at Contentful, and I'm overly excited. You already see it that we have some wonderful guests here today. So we have today with us David and Phil, which will give a few talks, or 2 talks today. And before we dive in, let's just do a little bit of housekeeping. And let me just repeat myself that I'm overly excited to have everybody here and have everybody watching. So before we just dive in, let me just share with you that this event follows our Contentful Developer Relations Community Code of Conduct. So in case there's anything that makes you feel uncomfortable, please feel free to reach out. We want to make this an as inclusive event as much as possible. So if there's anything happening, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. And if you want to learn more what the developer relations team or what Contentful Developer Community is up to, you can go to contentful.com/developers. And we have a fairly active Slack community. So if you want to join discussions in real time, ask questions, communicate, and collaborate with other developers, you can go to contentful.com/Slack. And if you wonder how to get started with GraphQL and Contentful's API, you can also go to Contentful CTFL.io/learn GraphQL. And if you then build something, you can go to CTFL.io/GraphQL swag, and we will send you a nice goodie package once you build something using our GraphQL API. And every Tuesday, not Wednesday, we're streaming live on YouTube and Twitch. So if you have any ideas on what we should build, we're building a lot of extensibility things, building apps, doing some GraphQL things. Shai did a little bit of CI/CD stuff with GitHub Actions lately. If you have any topics that we should cover live, you can join on YouTube and Twitch live on Tuesdays. So what are we going to do today? Today, we're going to have a brief look at our Contentful changelog to cover what happened and was released over the last month. And then I will hand it over to our friend Phil Hawksworth from Netlify, who will give a nice presentation that is called Joined Up Decoupled Thinking. And then we have David Leonard here, who is doing some fancy stuff with Storybook and Contentful. Afterwards, if you have any questions regarding Contentful, feel free to drop them in the chat. And we're going to address these later. This can be literally anything. And if someone wants to hang out and has a little bit of free time after this event, last month we played a round of Among Us. So if you want to join a fun game and want to figure out what all these people on the internet are playing these days, it is weirdly thrilling, I have to say. So I played it a few times now. And so if you want to play with us, you can come into our Slack and join the group monthly hangout, because we don't want to share a public video URL on the internet. So let's see if we can do that. I think it's a lot of fun. So yeah, and if you want to figure out or want to participate in these monthly community hangouts, you can just join Slack, let us know in the monthly hangout channel. So that was the housekeeping part. So what is new at Contentful? First of all, number one thing, if you want to keep track and you're building on Contentful, you can go to contentful.com/developers changelog. We publish whenever there's something new that is worth sharing with the developer community there. And for the people that prefer to have this via RSS, you can also subscribe to that so that you don't have to go there every week to see if there's something new. And over the last month, what we had is that we had some app framework updates. So in case you don't know Contentful's app framework allows you to extend the Contentful editing UI with basically custom code that runs in an iframe. And what we now have since last month is something that we called app identities and app events. And this allows you to build applications that can have a secure connection between a backend service and the application that runs in Contentful.com. So if you want to figure out how this works and how you can make your apps more secure, you can check out app identities and events. Then for the people that have a lot of spaces, we got a new space overview summary, and you can also now export this kind of things if you want to put it in Google Sheets, because we all live in Google Sheets. So you can do that now. And if you're changing and migrating and evolving a lot of content over time, you might be aware of our migration tooling. Heads up, we released version 4 of Contentful Migration. There's a breaking change in there. When you transform entries from one shape to the other, they are not automatically publishing anymore. So when you upgrade that, you now have to set a Boolean flag, because some people migrated a lot of content and were a little bit surprised that all their changes were immediately live. So you can now set a Boolean there, maybe do some more testing before you switch everything on. And with this, we're over the housekeeping, and I am already ready to hand it over to our friend, Phil.
All right. Let's see if I can share the right thing here.
All right. Sweet. And I'm going to kick everybody out. So the stage is all yours, Phil.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Okay, so off we go. Thanks. First of all, it's great to hear all of that stuff in the changelog. I confess that I haven't been to one of these before. I feel like a fool not coming before. So you'll see me here again. Lots of good stuff happening there. Hello to everyone. Welcome. Thanks for coming along, and thanks for tuning into this talk before we get to the fun stuff with David's talk shortly. A quick hello from me and a confession. I'm a little worried about this talk because I've got a terrible track record when it comes to talk titles. I've already heard Stefan stumble over my talk title, as I've done as well already, and I've got a history of this. Years ago, I did a talk called I Can Smell Your CMS because I was frustrated about content management systems leaking their code smells through the front end. One of the things that, of course, led me to systems like Contentful, where I got very enthusiastic about those tools. But no one knew what that talk was about. It was a ridiculous talk title, and hopefully I learnt my lesson and never came up with another talk title that was difficult. I feel like I came up with dynamic static site strategies when I was getting very excited about pre-rendered sites and static sites and those kind of hosting infrastructures. This is a ridiculous talk title that's meaningless and very difficult to say. So I decided never, ever, 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 ever again would I make that kind of mistake. So joined up decoupled thinking. I've learned nothing. It's a difficult talk title to say, and it doesn't seem like it means very much. So have I learned nothing? Well, maybe not when it comes to talk titles. What I'd like to think is that I've learned something when it comes to an approach to building sites and an approach to designing an architecture for delivering a site. And that's kind of what I want to share with you today, rather than just going down a memory lane of old talk titles. But, you know, I come from an agency background, so I'm a Netlify now, but I did about 9 years in agency land, wherein I was doing all kinds of design, technical architecture, technical solutions, trying to find the best way to deliver on a project to different clients' infrastructure, or where we could pick and choose our own infrastructure. And things have changed a lot over the years, and I've become very, very keen about decoupled architectures, which is what I want to talk about today, which is why this title, Joined Up Decoupled Thinking, hopefully will kind of lead us to a place where we talk about how we think about decoupled architectures, why they might be beneficial to us, and how we might overcome some of the pushbacks that we might get. So that's the intent. Stefan said, my name's Phil Hawksworth, and I'm a member of the developer experience team over at Netlify. I believe we'll have time for some questions at the end if I get it right. If I don't get this right, you can always ask me questions on Twitter. I'm at Phil Hawksworth on Twitter, and I'm very, very happy to talk about anything to do with these things, and whether it's Netlify or decoupled architectures or just webby stuff, I'm always keen to chat. So this notion of headless CMS, you know, when I first started talking about this quite a few years ago, this notion of a headless CMS was a little bit new, and I suspect that people on this call, since you're familiar with Contentful, this won't be something that's new to you. You know, a content management system which doesn't also include the presentation layer. It's headless, it's decoupled, if you like. And so this idea of having content management systems which were decoupled, so you would consume them through an API, They're getting quite well established now, but I think content management systems really were starting to push the boundaries from this a little while ago. But it's led us to a point that it's not just decoupled content management systems, but decoupled architectures. We're doing more and more through APIs in a decoupled manner. This is a fun thing from presenting from home. I just need to let a cat through a door. Go on then, off you go. Go on, that's all right, you're on the internet, go on. Seamless. That doesn't happen at conferences, does it? So this idea of decoupled architectures becoming much more than simply decoupling your content from the rest of your infrastructure. It's really led into all different kinds of services that we can develop our architectures on top of the approach. I've been very enthusiastic about this for a while because I'm very involved in the JAMSTACK space. So in other words, this model of pre-generating sites and then serving them as much as possible from a CDN as static resources. That being enabled to go much further than being static, thanks to JavaScript APIs and markup, which can run either in the client in the browser, or we can consume them elsewhere as well. And this whole approach has really been buoyed, I think, by the fact that this JAMSTACK ecosystem, as I waftily call it at times, has really been blossoming over the last few years, and Contentful is right there in the forefront of that. And what do I mean when I say JAMSTACK ecosystem? Well, I'm talking about, well, this is a slide from a few years ago, which I harvested from the internet, and this changes all the time, but I think this is a great indication of how much this ecosystem is flourishing. We've got lots of different APIs and services that are there, and you can see Contentful nestled right there in the front of the API section for headless CMS. But there are all kinds of other utilities that are available as an API. You know, you've got Algolia for search, you've got Auth0 for identity and authentication, you've got Stripe for e-commerce, and a gazillion more besides. And this ecosystem, this kind of economy of APIs, if you like, the API economy is really flourishing. So it enables us to design our solutions quite differently, I think, to the way we might have done in the past. Slight self-serving little link along the way. At Netlify yesterday, we actually launched our technology partners program. And if you wanted to find out about that, this is kind of related to the API economy and like the services that are around this world. You can find information at that for that at findthat.at/partners. I'll share these slides at the end as well, so none of these links will be lost to you. So this API economy really has been thriving, and that really is what has enabled us to really push the chips into the middle of the table and really bet on these decoupled architectures as a way of delivering our site. But the problem with any change in a technology approach, of course, and the problem with evolving tastes and approaches is that, you know, sometimes people take a bit of convincing. You know, we've been doing things a certain way for a long time, and now things are starting to evolve. So there is a certain amount of FUD out there in the world. And if you've not come across that term before, well, congratulations, first of all, good for you. But sadly, it does stand for fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And you kind of used to come across this term really as a way of, you know, people would be throwing stones at a concept or trying to undermine a concept. But more and more, I kind of think of fear, uncertainty, and doubt really more as just healthy skepticism or people to be won over. But certainly when I started pitching these decoupled architectures, I was getting quite a bit of pushback. And that's frustrating because I also think there are lots of wins to be had, lots of success available to us in projects if we go down this route. So getting to it finally, I want to talk a little bit about addressing some of those common bits of FUD and some thoughts about how this architecture leads us to achieve all kinds of nice ones. First of all, a couple of little definitions, or let's get rid of some of the what segments of our thinking. I've mentioned decoupled architecture and traditional architecture. Let's just unpack those a little bit to give us some context for what we're going to talk about. Traditional architecture, this is somewhat simplified, being that there are only two boxes on this diagram. But we might have thought of, you know, our clients and web browsers or other places making a request to our infrastructure, to our application servers, if you like, and getting their responses back and doing something with it. There could be a lot inside that app server box, but the key thing to remember is that you own all of that. In the traditional architecture, you own all of it, and there could be a lot. And in fact, often if we unpack some of these things, we'll discover that there's all kinds of logic and services and bits of infrastructure inside the web properties that we own. And as we're building these things out traditionally, we're responsible for it all. So that's thinking about in a traditional sense. In a decoupled sense, you still own maybe the way that you're serving sites, perhaps, but abstracting out and decoupling, and this is probably not news to the people on this session, but let's go through that way. Note the fact that now we're abstracting away some of these services, we're decoupling them out, and happily other domain experts now own those. So those aren't part of our responsibility anymore. We've abstracted them away. We might consume those, at build time, at request time, as part of how we return responses to things. We might be making use of those things directly from the client, perhaps with JavaScript, or all of the above. We've got all kinds of options there for how that might work. Increasingly, and I should be, I ought to mention this as someone who works at Netlify, we might not even own and operate the web server infrastructure ourselves. We might be just owning this bit, the deployable artifacts that then get distributed to other people's infrastructure. So the thing that we have to own and operate and maintain happily is shrinking so that we can make use of all of these other things. So everything's perfect. That's nice. No problems to be found, except for this FUD thing we mentioned. So this is really one of the main things I wanted to talk about today. How can we address some of the common reservations people have about using a decoupled architecture, about using tools such as Contentful or any of the other things that would be in the API economy that we talk about? So here are a few of the things that I've often come up against, and over the years, how I've argued, for this approach to try and win through and be able to deploy things in this way. So the first one that I often have come across is all these dependencies add too much risk. We might have heard this before when we're pitching some of these services. And people, when they're saying that, they mean, what if they go away? What if the service goes away? What if they break? Can they be trusted? So that's a very common bit of fear, uncertainty, and doubt about using this kind of thing. And so that thought about all these dependencies add too much risk, I'd offer these as good kind of arguments for winning over this architecture. I'd offer, for services who are offering, for companies who are offering a service like this, their entire business depends on the continued good standing of their specific service. So let's again take Contentful as our example. Contentful are responsible for providing a content management service and content as an API. Not doing lots of things here in this environment. Their special source is all of those things, and their business depends on doing that well. And so in that respect, they're going to put a lot of effort into making sure that works and works properly. Their success demands dedicated domain experts. There are people building things at companies such as Contentful who really have the domain expertise to do that and well. We saw at the beginning of this session some of the things that are coming from Contentful. I don't think we would be able to commit to that kind of evolution and progress if this service was something internal to our own project. And also, if we were to do that, what team would we allocate to each of these capabilities? Now, this might be my agency background showing through here, and thinking about a project team and deciding, well, if we're going to build out an experience, which members of the team are going to be building out and maintaining some of these services that have to be present for our projects? That can be a useful way to address this conversation of all these dependencies add too much risk. Moving on, another one I hear a lot, using lots of services will impact performance. Whenever I'm talking about decoupled architectures or JAMSTACK things on Twitter, see quite often people saying, oh, you're just going to throw lots of services at it, performance is going to go through the floor. This thing is going to run like a dog, is what people are saying. Well, answers to that, there's likely to be far more dedicated engineering and infrastructure for each of the dedicated services than we'd be able to dedicate ourselves. If we were to build this and maintain it ourselves, we wouldn't be able to get close to putting that kind of effort into making sure the performance of these services is appropriate. And also, a service which is nearby isn't necessarily faster. When I say nearby, I mean technically closer, whether that's in your own hosted infrastructure or your own base. Just because you own it and it's close to the other code doesn't mean it's faster. Lots of engineering work goes into making these things perform really, really well. And as consumers of that, we can ride that wave and really benefit as a result. Another one that I hear a lot is we can't let this content out of our control. That's a very, very common one. Again, if you're working in projects in either agency land or if you're building perhaps a product or a project with clients. And what we're talking about there is we're suggesting giving away the family jewels. Our kind of critical business differentiator. Are we talking about giving that away? My response is to that, each vendor is likely to have more strict and established compliant regulations than you'd be ready to commit to yourself. And I'm cautious in a presentation about using words like compliance and regulations. It's not necessarily exciting, but it's important. And companies that this as their core business, of course, have to do really diligent work in that regard. So, when we're looking around for services, we can look for certification and compliance and really do the due diligence when we're selecting our vendors. And we're likely to find, again, the domain expertise puts us in a far better place for this than if we were to roll it ourselves. Okay, next. Using these services will lock us in. I'm curious to know how many people have heard that when you've suggested using any other tool or service on the web that you might consume via an API. What if we want to make some changes in future? This one is an interesting one, I think, because I'd say that using these services via APIs demands that you've got really clear delineation and build to defined integrations. If a company is offering their service via an API, that's a very, very clean and definitive boundary that you've got to work to. So as a result, the software that you write will have to be clean and have good delineation of what the responsibilities are as well. So actually, this can lead to probably having much looser coupling with your code, and then actually getting greater flexibility than building everything in-house like you might do otherwise. So again, it enforces that discipline and that structure and that rigor to give you good separation. One of the things that attracted me to this model in the very first place was the fact that I didn't make a service, I would move over to another one. If you're defining the way that you work to an API, you've got that loose coupling, which is actually really liberating. Okay, so those are a few examples of common bits of FUD that I encounter and the way that I try and argue against them. Of course, a very good way to address this is through things like citing examples. And this is getting better all the time because the ecosystem is flourishing, more people are building this way, so there are more things to point at. Just a few that I'd mention quickly that are kind of pertinent to work that I've done, been involved with at Netlify. Here's one, Victoria Beckham Beauty, which is a beauty brand with e-commerce. There's a case study you could read about this if you like, and once again, there's the URL for it. It's find that at case study/VB. But this project was incredibly rapid. It's a very performant e-commerce site. It doesn't have the largest product list in the world, but that's okay. Not all of us are building Amazon. It's still a very, very good example. This is a project was originally penned to have a 6-month development time, and the agency that built this halfway through the project discovered that the platform that they'd been kind of led to was not quite going to be able to do what they needed. It wasn't really giving them the speed and the turnaround that they needed, and they needed to make a change. 3 months into a 6 months project, they re-architected this as a decoupled architecture, using Contentful, using Shopify APIs, and some other integrations behind the scenes as this decoupled project, and got it successfully delivered within 3 months of making that change. Really impressive stuff, and it performs really, really well. So there's a case study you can read about should you wish for more information on that. Another one, ButcherBox, which is a subscription service for meat. Who knew? What a time to be alive. This is another e-commerce project, which again, you can read the case study, find that at casestudy/BB for ButcherBox. Bacon to your door. I'm really keen. So this used to be a WordPress project. They kind of outgrew that platform and then moved over to Laravel Nova, again using Contentful, the content behind the scenes, using other services as well, using Cypress for all kinds of testing, and also using their own custom APIs. Now, this is something I just wanted to call out quickly, that you don't have to be just using services from other people. Decoupling also means that you can decouple your front end from your own APIs and have separation of concerns that way. So that's something else that the team at ButcherBox did. And again, you can read that case study there. One more that I'll just call out before I move on, I need to be mindful of time, is a company called Clepier, who are an operator of shopping malls in Europe. I think they're one of the largest shopping mall operators in Europe, 150 or so malls around 14 European countries. They used to be on Sitecore, and they moved to Sitecore headless. So a headless version of Sitecore, also supplemented with their own custom APIs, which were decoupled. This allowed them to massively reduce their infrastructure costs, because they now were using this decoupled model, and served content to 98 retailers, and they did that change within 6 months, launching 98 new retail online presences. Really interesting case study there. Find that at casestudy/clep. So I will add some more cats. I don't think I've got any cats. I'm worried for Stu. Stick with me, Stu. The cat might back, but there's no more in the slides. But Clepier were driving not just their retail store sites, but also progressively editing those with more real-time information about what's happening in the stores, opening times, and those kind of things that they can make changes to by decoupling their APIs, decoupling their content, and decoupling their data, and serving these things through APIs. So there's an interesting case study to be read there as well. Okay, I need to move on. Talk about achieving wins. Let's talk about a few places that if we go down this route and we decouple these things in these ways, where can we win? So there's a bunch of places that I think we can win. You know, designing, you get a win. Planning, you get a win. Estimating, and you get a win. Delivery, you get a win. I feel like Oprah. In all of these different stages, there are places that we can have particular benefits. I'm just going to touch on them quickly before we move on. The designing stage, when I'm talking about the technical design stage, this was a real revelation to me. At the point that I could consider different APIs services that I could use rather than knowing that I could roll my own, it really helped make a very, very clear mental model. And I know this is a silly little diagram, and it's not particularly meaningful, and it'll be small for you and difficult. But I love this stage of designing something technically when I'm drawing lines and boxes and understanding what's responsible for what, and we can start to draw on different services for different things, whether that's, you know, Contentful editorial content, or if it's something like Fauna for as a database, as a service, or what have you. You can really move through this phase more quickly. You're starting to get familiar with these different services that are around and understand how you can consume their services via APIs. It gives you a phrase, clear delineation, and that helps create really clear logic. So when groups come together to design a response to a project or to a problem, it really helps them have a very clear logical thinking. Planning. At this point, you're shopping for services, and what a lovely thing we're able to do that now. We can actually, start exploring the services that are out there, and happily there are more all the time, and we can start sizing them up and seeing what their capabilities are, but also what their costs are, what kind of SLA do they have, what kind of compliance and regulatory compliance do they have, is that we wouldn't want to build ourselves. What kind of support do they have? Because of course, we need the support for these services. Again, if we're role alone, we have to support them as well. So the planning stage, going around and looking at the different APIs and services that are there is a really wonderful thing, and it really helps you again have clear thinking about what you're going to build and how you might deliver it. Estimating, something I always hated. If there's anyone who loves estimating, please make a comment in the chat and we'll point at you, and I think we might call you a liar. I don't know. I hate estimating because estimating is often guessing, particularly when it comes to infrastructure, which might need to scale. So here we've got much more defined cost structures. We can see how much things are going to cost. We've got pricing models that we can lean on. So it's much more predictable. It has much greater predictability. There's the sentence. It takes some of the guesswork out of, how much infrastructure will it cost to serve X. And finally, delivering. It's lovely to be building on productized APIs where we've got documentation, we've got examples, and we've got people who can help us with maintaining those things. So right through the building and then delivering of the project, there are wins to be had there as well. So I like to think of all of these things when I'm thinking about how I might present this technical architecture, a decoupled architecture, to clients or to my team members to try and convince them that this could be a good model. So I'm kind of out of time. So a final thought, really, and then we'll be moving on to another talk where we might see some more things in action. But a final thought from me is that decoupled architectures unlock otherwise unattainable projects. I've so often been in the situation where if we had to build everything in-house, it just would not have been viable in terms of the skills, the time to market, and the cost. So I'd say between us, we can kind of overturn some of the FUD that we encounter in this world, and we can start enjoying the for the win. So that's kind of what I wanted to show you, thinking about what now, what next. There are a few resources that I've shared along the way, but also that you might find this of interest. I hope this isn't out of line, Stefan. He's sharing another Slack when you've already directed people so nicely to the Contentful Slack. But a lot of these kind of models and architectures, people kick these around in discussions in the JAMSTACK Slack, and you can happily come and join that at jamstack.org/Slack. Those case studies I mentioned and a lot of other thinking along the sides happens on the Netlify blog. We talk about that there, so you can find that on the Netlify blog. I'm also going to shamelessly shout a podcast I'm involved in with my fellow DevRel developer experience colleagues at Netlify. Remotely Interested is our podcast, and you can find that at remotelyinteresting.netlify.com. We hypothesize about these kind of things a lot, and we also happily answer questions and get into discussions if you want to throw things at us. And the last one I just recommend is a resource from one of my excellent colleagues, Jason Lengsdorf. Learnwithjason.dev is this incredible set of resources of things where he has someone come on and teach him something, and they always build something together. And so often it's using a decoupled architecture, a service that he'll integrate and build on top of. I can't recommend it highly enough. 31 minutes, excuse me running over just a tiny bit, but that's it for me. Many thanks for having me. I hope some of that made sense. I hope my internet stayed okay. Please feel free to ask me questions about this and on Twitter. Thanks ever so much.
Woohoo! Thank you so much, Phil.
My very great pleasure.
So if anyone has questions, we're looking for in the chat for a few more minutes. You unpacked a lot there. I think the cost. So I also used to work at several startups, right? And I had this discussion about, hey, this costs $200, maybe $500, and this is too much. We don't have that. But then it's always the question, yeah, but I can build that in 3 months, and then we can do the math.
And there are so many things like that people think, oh, that seems simple enough. We can just write a little bit of code for that. And a lot of these things are simple enough as long as you stay just on the happy path and you just do the one thing you think of at the moment that you're thinking about the problem, but it quickly unpacks in these things. And I've been down that road before. I think a lot of us have made things and then discovered, oh, think about X. Companies exist now properly for us.
Oh no, now you're breaking a little bit, Phil. Oh no. Well, I think we I think we lost Phil. I think then it's time. Oh, we're back.
Oh dear, I hope it hasn't been like that throughout. I'll be sharing my slides and what have you afterwards in case I've been glitching. I apologize.
Cool, it's all right. Yeah, and the other thing that I just wanted to point out is that it is fabulous times right now to just be a front-end engineer. What Jason does on stream, it is really like this. With a friend of mine once said that he knows enough JavaScript to be dangerous, and it feels really like that you can build a product in a day by just connecting all these pieces, and I think it's wonderful.
Totally, yeah. It's amazing how many tools we've got at our disposal now, isn't it? And the things I've had to try and solve in the past, but now I was like, thank you, I'll use experts instead.
Totally agree. Cool. Then thank you very much, Phil. When you paste the slides into the private chat, we're going to post it into the public chats all around the world. And thanks so much for hanging out with us.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I appreciate it. I'll be hanging out to chat along and follow along with the rest. Thanks so much.
And as a side note, you left out your cat very smoothly, by the way.
You know, they cats don't give a monkeys what's going on the screen.
These cats. Cool. Thanks so much.
Cheers.
Cool. And with this, we're switching the topic a little bit to our I Built This section, and we have David with us already. And I've had one call, I think, with you, David, and you had a few other calls with the other David. And you're building overall with our David, who's doing a lot of things around the app framework. And you want to share some things about Storybook and what you're building with it. Is that right?
Yeah. Absolutely. So I will share my screen and hopefully I press the right button. So I've not used this tool before.
We are pressing the buttons. You just have to share.
There we go. So fingers crossed, you guys should in a second see my Chrome.
We see your Chrome and awesome. Here we go.
Fantastic. So I guess, first of all, thank you, Stefan, and also team at Contentful for allowing me to speak about this. And also thank you, everybody who was there, for actually listening. And finally, thank you, Phil, for that great talk you just gave. And I'm very sad I don't actually have a cat at all to let out. I do have a dog who might bark at one point, but she's not currently in the room. So I'm going to present around actually how I've been doing some work in terms of combining, I guess, some of the bits you can do within Storybook and also some of the stuff you can do within the app framework within Contentful and kind of bashing it together to hopefully build something which is useful for everybody in terms of your kind of team who's using Contentful. So kind of my background, I'm a techie, worked in various kind of roles, worked in agencies and now working for a startup. And I will quickly kind of show you what I'm working on first, because I will show you some bits of this when we go through demos later on. So I'm working for a company called Planet Super League. We're a small startup. And the idea is actually what we're trying to do is infuse people about doing things to the environment by having them actually get points for their football club. So we're actually working with some community trusts associated with some teams in England. So we're working with community trusts associated with Aston Villa, Leicester, West Bromwich Albion, Wolves, and also some kind of other teams as well up and down the football pyramid. And at the moment, Leicester are absolutely killing it. They're doing fantastically well in this challenge. And we're using Contentful for all of our content, kind of, obviously, so it's such a fantastic platform. And the two kind of main bits we're actually using Contentful for in terms of setup, because it's not the most complicated at the moment. We're creating component-driven pages. So this one on the left here is component-driven page, where you can just kind of drag and drop the different components and, you know, change the orders and what have you. And that works very well. And then secondly, we've got all these activities that you get these points for in order to get your team up the leaderboard. And we've also got all of those stored within Contentful as well. well. And then as users go through, they can actually see their impact in terms of what they're achieving for their club, and also actually what they're achieving for the environment as well, in terms of all of the fantastic actions they're actually doing. So that is Planet Super League. And so I've mentioned, obviously I don't really have to introduce Contentful whatsoever. I'm assuming most people here have either heard, played around with, or just seen demos of Storybook. But I'll just touch first in terms of the absolute basics, in terms of how that works. It's kind of crucial in terms of where this talk will kind of develop. So Storybook, well, it's not hard, it's not rocket science, right? For those of you who've used it, I'm just going to jump out of my presentation here, and I will show you a demo Storybook that I've got nothing to do with, but I feel like it gives quite a good view of what you can actually achieve with Storybook. So for those of you who have seen it, this will look very familiar. So essentially what you're doing within Storybook is getting all of your front-end components, you're shoving it in here, and you're providing a way to actually have a nice visual way of looking over them. You can also validate your code is very much kind of self-encapsulated in terms of your components. They work very well. And from a QA point of view as well, you can just go in, you can play around with your components, and just validate that the person who's coded it has actually done it in a, well, diligently, I guess, more than anything else. So we've got, for instance, a kind of card tab here, and on the Lonely Planet one, you can kind of see, well, actually how it behaves if it's a video, how does it behave if it's a book, well, actually, if you've got a price on it, how does the price come across? And we can do this for the various bits. So we've got things like carousels that they've got here as well that doesn't work particularly well on my screen, but it kind of gives you a bit of an idea. And what's really great with Storybook is some of the extensions. So I guess one of the kind of cool ones, and one of the things which I got my inspiration on for a lot of what I built here, is this one which is here is called knobs. On the newer version of Storybook, it's actually called controls, but it allows us to actually just play around with the content. So if I kind of just start typing in here, we can actually see that the text I'm writing under bullets is actually kind of appearing up here. And if I had an image path at the moment, I could actually swap out that image and we'd see a much more immediate change. So from a QA point of view, that's quite a useful tool to actually validate, and you can also get accessibility plugins and various bits to actually validate other stuff. And from a developer's point of view, if I'm coming onto a project, then I can actually see how stuff's been built in a very kind of isolated manner to be able to kind of take it and use it elsewhere. So absolutely fantastic tool, right? And jumping kind of back into here, and as most of you would have seen who have written the stories are just so simple to write. I mean, this is the example from actually creating a story in the first instance from the Storybook website. So you basically create a file which is called, in this case, button.stories.js. And as with many people, I generally do forget to put stories in the file name, and then I wonder why it doesn't actually show up any of my stories. You define actually what your template looks like, and then essentially each of your stories is just binding into that template and providing different arguments. So in this case, for the button, we've got a primary, a secondary, a large and a small button as they show up here. And actually, as you click through each of these different ones, you'll then just see a different state based on what args you're actually putting in. And that's basically the args. The args are basically your props going into the component you're using as your template. So that's, it's really cool. It's really useful. But if you look at actually the knobs or the controls, and in terms of your stories, in terms of actually validating what you're working on, you're kind of limited by what you're putting in the code in terms of your stories, and also what your team puts in. So say, for instance, your QA is kind of going into Storybook, and is just maybe they've got some test cases written up for this, and they're taking it from the test cases, writing it in. Or say, for instance, they're just doing some exploratory testing. Well, it can take a little bit of time, or it can be, if they're doing exploratory, how do you make sure that actually some of the things which may result in a problem, how do you make sure you catch that every time? How can we extend on this a bit? Well, actually, if you look at how the plugin system works within Storybook, it's actually incredibly straightforward. So again, this is just taken from the Storybook website, which is absolutely fantastic in terms of providing guidance around how to set any bits and pieces up. But this is the absolute most basic kind of add-on you can create in terms of just getting a panel in the bottom of your page. So you need to register an add-on. So in this case, they've just called it design add-on, and then it's just a React component. And that's it. You can have whatever you want in that React component, and it's got various kind of bits and pieces you can actually hook into. And one of the key bits in terms of how knobs or controls work is actually one of the hooks which it utilizes. So there's a there is a use args kind of hook, and within that you can actually pull out the args for a particular story, but key is obviously updating args here. And well, actually, I mean, I guess a kind of key story here is actually, rather than having our QA going in and manually editing, like, why don't we actually just load some real content? Why don't we actually create a block which can kind of sit in this bottom section here, you know, and list it out? And this for me is where actually it kind of just makes sense to use Contentful. You know, we can use the Contentful SDK to pull out the content we want, display it in a list, and then, you know, click on it. Bob's your uncle, essentially. It just displays it for us. And it kind of is that straightforward, really. So if I kind of just go out and kind of just show you it in terms of how it sits, just give you a kind of quick reminder in terms of sites. It looks a little bit like this. We are actually kind of mobile only at the moment, so looks a little bit weird on desktop. So we've got all of these kind of lovely components here. And if we go into Storybook here, I've got it set up here. So we've got this dynamic pages kind of section, and essentially, which is where all of the bits from Contentful are going to be either dynamic component, generally going to be dynamic components. Then there's kind of activities as well, but most of the stuff's in here. And I guess to start with, I'll pick one of the simple ones. So if I just click on highlight stat here, which is very simple. So actually you can see straight away it's loads on the Contentful kind of block here. We also do have controls here. So if I want to kind of go ahead and edit this, and I'm not going to write any sentence here, I can see what happens if I change the text, right? Just as we saw kind of earlier, change the number here again, absolutely great. But actually the other thing I can do is I can just click on this, and actually it's loaded from Contentful this bit of content, and it just brings it straight into here. Where this starts, now in this case, we've actually got something that's very simple. You know, we've just got some text fields, essentially nothing more than that. Where this starts getting a little bit, well, I would say a lot more helpful, is we're actually looking at a more complex kind of layout. So I guess one of the limitations you get within Storybook is actually if you look at the controls down here, well, actually, we've got a lot of sub-objects in here. And the way we represent this within Contentful is we've got a parent item, which is our kind of activity list. And then within that, we've just got allow child references, a list of child references. And actually, from a QA point of view, if you want to do some testing on that, it's obviously a little bit harder in terms of if you want to use Storybook for it. So actually, it's one of the ways where this is absolutely fantastic. So we've got a list here of the different columns we've got in place here, and actually I can just click on each of those. I mean, that one's a very short one, so we can kind of click through on that there, and we can just kind of click through and actually just see how it kind of all works. That's quite cool. And actually what's really useful with this as well is actually, it's probably not quite so much with this one, probably more on the last one, is actually as soon as I've adjusted the args, I can actually change them within here, within controls, as we got here, we're all kind of knobs in a previous version of Storybook as well. So I kind of go in here, I can just change it, and it kind of works in the same way. So, you know, it's kind of useful thing that we can kind of do here and kind of play around with. As you can see, there's a hell of a lot of content which actually kind of utilized there, and click on those bits and pieces. And actually even up to kind of, as we got here, we've got basically a fairly empty one at the moment by default, but I can actually load it in as it displays in the page as well, to actually get a full kind of page view of what the user will actually see. So that's kind of interesting, right? But I guess the other thing is, if I kind of go back in here, is, well, kind of how does it work, you know? And it's fairly straightforward. So we've got a Contentful SDK, and at the moment, I don't know if I should be kind of ashamed to say this or not, but we're actually using a RESTful SDK for this, and I can kind of go into the reasons why a little bit later in the talk. So we pull out all of the data from that. Depending on what type of content we want, we might actually need to pull for different depths in that. So say, for instance, when we looked at that one, which is just purely text, well, obviously we just need to pull that very top layer item. When it comes to the activity list, well, actually we need to go down a couple of items to make sure we pull all of the media. We obviously pull the kind of sub items, the activities as well. So we pull that stuff in, then on click, it's just updating the args. One thing to note here, if you are interested in exploring this further, I definitely recommend looking up the core events within Storybook, because I think there's about 20, 30 different core events you can actually hook into, which allows you kind of just to extend it a bit more. And actually the way this kind of works, it uses one of those hooks behind the scenes rather than actually using the use args as we just saw previously. And in terms of the plugin itself, well, we've got add-on panel exactly as we saw before. One thing to note here is actually this line here. So we're pulling out from a parameter of Contentful the content type, essentially in the depth, and we define that at a template a stories kind of level, essentially. So within the stories, you set up your parameters. So it might be, for instance, on stories already, you're doing things like, for instance, setting the size of the window in case you want to show certain components on mobile, some on desktop. You can customize all that stuff with parameters. Likewise with this, I've just set up parameters which exist via Contentful as a prefix, and then we can pull out a type and depth from that. That goes straight into Contentful item selected. API I've worded badly, but that is basically the Storybook API, and we make use of that in order to actually call the hooks in order to update the content fundamentally. And if we kind of click through on this, and here are the parameters in terms of what happens within the story itself. So I'm using a lovely hot pink image by default, and just got some very basic kind of text to go along with it. So that's an incredibly simple version, which is just kind of an image block, which provides essentially a label over the top of an image in different kind of guises. And within Contentful itself, we pass in our type there, type name, depth, that's it, essentially. And that basic version is all you need. Now, I guess one of the questions that some of you have probably got in your head, well, if I look at the Contentful structure I've got for a lot of my data types, well, it's going to be completely different to actually what I've got in terms of what I need for my components. And, you know, that is obviously a bit of an issue, and actually this code needs a little bit of refactoring. But from that being the case, actually what I do in terms of the init process is actually set up mappings. And I would like to get it a bit more efficient in terms of how the mappings work at the moment, but there's two kind of layers to it. Like, number one, the mappings, you can provide a default one. So for instance, if you have got a common format of data in terms of how you're pulling into props, it might be you can go for a common function and then just get them all displaying in that same way, and that's absolutely great for you. However, when you look at something like the activity list, where you've got something a little bit different, you've got the child kind of items within it. Obviously, actually with the GQL one, because you're actually got something which kind of removes some of the layers that you get with the, I guess, a more traditional REST one, you possibly don't need to do this quite so much. But with this one, for instance, with the process activities list, you know, we are doing a little bit of manipulation here. And I do have a common function I can use for most of the bits to actually make it a little bit easier. So we basically run it through that kind of mapping function so that what comes through to Contentful is the right format in terms of passing it through to the component itself in Storybook. And that's it. And that's quite useful, you know, from a QA point of view. It just makes that quicker. Like, I've had various instances within agencies where you hand it over to the clients, and within a day they kind of tell me they've put content in, it's not displaying how they're expecting it to, because they may have, you know, missed out a field that we were kind of expecting to put in, and we didn't mark it as required in the right way or something like that, you know. And actually this gives us a very quick way of validating that. You know, we can go in, we can see it in isolation by just clicking on the button. So from a dev point of view, that's, you know, it's really useful. From a QA point of view, it's kind of useful as well. But actually, if I was to say to the editor, we've got this great tool, what you can do, you can go into Storybook, you can click this button, you can see what's happening up here. Are they really going to care? You know, is your product owner going to care? Is the wider team going to care? Well, possibly not. Well, probably not, I kind of suggest. And actually, that's where it comes into the bit which, I guess, hence the title of the talk, well, much more useful tool is to bring it into Contentful itself. And, you know, the actual application framework for Contentful, done various bits and pieces in it before, and it's just incredibly flexible. And I was kind of thinking, well, actually, if you consider, essentially, if you look at Contentful as being a real estate for the editor, you've got all of these fields which you can kind of go into, you can amend. Actually, is there any reason why we can't just bring the preview in there as part of that real estate? Because it is incredibly useful for them to be able to see it. And actually, if I look back at some of the agency projects I've kind of had over the years, where actually the way something's been designed, it's quite ambiguous, essentially, in terms of what a content item might be within Contentful. You know, you might have 3 or 4 different blocks which has got like an image on the left and text on the right, and actually how do you differentiate them? And actually being able to have that preview in line is potentially incredibly useful, right? And also more immediate feedback as well. And actually that's essentially what we're going to go into, because fundamentally, if you look at Storybook, it's already got the functionality to give you a page as an iframe, or just give you that story as an iframe, as opposed to showing all of it. So we can kind of take that, I'm simplifying it slightly, but we can essentially take that iframe, shove it into Contentful, and we can basically have an inline preview. And for smaller components, like we saw with the, like we see here with the carousel we've got here, it might be we actually display it in line, and that's absolutely great. And then as users are editing content, they're actually seeing it change. Fantastic. I guess the problem becomes is when you're looking at kind of larger content. And the great thing with the API and the kind of extensions tools from Contentful is you can kind of do both. So you can replace entry fields if you want to create a template for a field. And essentially what we do is we wrap over the top of any data type. So we can say, well, actually, I've got this data type, which is basically called like, you know, storybook preview. And I want to say that if a person puts in an object, they can use a view, which is storybook preview rather than the default one. And as a result, the preview just kind of pops up essentially. And likewise, you can actually have a full screen view of it as well, which kind of just basically kind of either replaces or kind of adds on to your kind of editor view essentially. So if I jump out of here and I'm just going to go into Storybook so I can show them in situ. So the one we saw before was this one here, so the highlight stats, and I will just reload this. So what you'll probably see for a second when we reload this is the fact that actually you see the Storybook content load initially for a split second, and then because we're essentially firing into the same hook within Storybook, it's then loading the data via Contentful instead. So if we just boot this up, and it will reload hopefully quite quickly. And one thing to note here, you will notice a delay of a little bit of time before we bring in preview, and I'll explain that at the end. So there we go. It just boots up straight away. And actually, if we kind of just click on add some tests in here, and I'm just going to publish, so it's a little bit quicker. There we go. We just see the text being amended right there in situ, right? And that's fantastic. If we want to amend the figure here as well. One thing to note is Contentful will not always save it immediately. So you will find there is kind of a little bit of a delay at times, but it is fairly kind of prompt, and you know that's kind of it essentially. So in that case, it's taking a little bit longer. So that's great, right? But I mean that's quite a simple example. I mean, where it probably gets a little bit more interesting is when you look at something like this, where we've actually got a carousel instead. And in that situation, well, what can we see? Well, if I kind of go back to start this list here, well, maybe if we just kind of swap around some of these items, right? So if we just swap out Christmas gift to be the first item rather than the second item, and hopefully this will save in seconds, it just immediately swaps over. Now, how this works is quite interesting because this will also show you I guess the current limitations in terms of how this is working. So if I kind of just jump back into this presentation, I can just jump you through exactly how it's kind of working under the hood. So my initial version of this, I did exactly what I said before I kind of went into demo, and actually just, you know, I pulled the iframe from Contentful and I just shoved it in as a extension I took the URL from Storybook, grabbed the iframe version, moved it into Contentful, displayed it, and it worked. The problem then being it was very much limited to the single type, because actually how do you tell Contentful what type I'm actually looking at? And if it was just a single type within Storybook, it just becomes a little bit more awkward. It becomes a bit more complicated. So I'll show you how that bit works in a minute. But essentially what we have is a base layer component. And as Stefan said at the start of this call, that actually just is basically an iframe. We've then got a config page in Contentful, and that allows you to actually just specify, well, for each of my content types, I want to use this story ID. And the story ID, you can just go into Storybook and you can just pull out what's in the URL. So if I kind of just go back here, for instance, we'll see it fully in a minute. I can just pull out, well, I want to use this ID here. So in the case of, for instance, with a dynamic component list, if I want to display without header, I can actually see this without header. If I want to see it embedded within the page, I can actually click on full page instead. You know, so actually there is definitely a need to be able to define which of your stories you actually want to use depending on what you're doing within Storybook. So if I kind of present in here again, and I will click through on that, and that story ID, it basically just maps into that. So in this case, I'm just using a local version of Storybook just for the example. And then the next bit, and this might prove slightly contentious in terms of how I've done it, and I'll explain why in a second, why I've done it the way I've done it in a second. So the next bit, as soon as it loads, we then use a window.post message. Not contentious in itself in terms of how we're doing it. So the Contentful extension iframe is basically loading a second iframe within it, which is a bit of a pain. I would like to kind of be able to do it directly in that parent, but it kind of feels a bit odd changing the URL of the parent when we're you know, basically need to convert what the story ID is. So that parent one is actually called in a post item. Now I'm only sending it the ID of that content item. Initially, when I started running with this, I actually provided the actual content item itself that I was pulling via the Contentful extensions SDK, but I found that actually that was coming out in a different format than I was actually happy with. And it was a different format in terms of how I built it underneath the hood. And it just all became a little bit awkward, and I ended up making functions for the sake of just using this. And I feel the key thing for me about this as a product is making it so it just fits into your workflow. You know, if you're using Storybook already and you're using Contentful, you should not have to add, or you should have to write absolutely minimal logic in order to have this working if it's to be a success for your product, essentially. Otherwise, it becomes an afterthought and it doesn't become successful, right? Fundamentally. So by passing in just the content item, you can load the content within the extension, within the Storybook instance, in the same way that you're actually doing within your code base, essentially. So that's essentially why I've done it that way. And then, as I kind of mentioned before, the onsys changed kind of within Contentful. Every time there's an update, we just call that again. Just send the content item ID again. So it's not the most efficient way of doing it, but it's the safest way of doing it. And if you consider, for instance, where this kind of got tricky before when I was trying to pass the actual object itself rather than just the ID, is when we look at things like the carousel, where we've got those child items, or we've got more complicated structures that we're trying to pull into this inline preview. It just didn't work the way I was expecting it to. And actually, it would have been more work trying to hack around that, essentially, rather than just passing the ID down and do a separate lookup within the extension itself, within the Storybook. Now, one of the really cool things that kind of happens within apps, and I'll kind of jump in and actually display this, is actually how you can create your own config now for your extensions. So if I kind of jump out here, and I will click on one of these. And if I go into apps, I'm going to manage my apps. And there's only one active one, which is this one. We can just go in here. We can provide whichever domain we're using. So at the moment, I'm kind of in development. So I'm kind of just hooked into a development domain in terms of components themselves. And then actually, you're not probably going to want to do this for all your components necessarily. It might be you have very small level ones where actually it's almost an irrelevance kind of having it in there, but you'll see that actually I've just passed in those story IDs for the vast majority of those kind of components there. And then as soon as you update that, hit on the save, and then you can make use of it, essentially. And if I just go into the content model, I'll just show you actually how it works as well in terms of the activity row. So we've got a decent number of content types at the moment. And actually, when we look at it here, the thing that I've actually hooked it into in terms of the extension is the content type. If you go under appearance, you actually can see that actually your object type you can use the default, or you can actually select a different one. In that case, I've just hooked in this Storybook preview to be a separate one, which the user can actually select. And that's kind of it. So I guess the one that I haven't actually shown is actually separate windows. Let me show you that quickly. So in the case of the pages I showed you, well, actually, it kind of makes sense having it as a separate editor view. And then it is a case of actually, well, you edit it within this page here, and then you can see the preview here. But, you know, the theory is basically exactly the same there. So if I kind of just go back, and I'll go back through the kind of rest of this. So we kind of had a look at that already. And we have seen that already as well. And this is the difference essentially between doing it as a field within your type and actually how you want to do it as an entry editor. So you go over to entry editors and just add a new item essentially for a Storybook preview. And the very fact you've actually defined that global kind of config for it within the apps, you don't have to do anything else. Then it will just pick up, well, actually, this is my type here, component activities row. I need to link to this particular story. Now, in terms of complications, I think I've spoken already around the top one in terms of the fact they're not equal. The reason why there's a delay on load is the fact you get this 429 kind of issue of too many requests in Contentful. Sorry, I've jumped to the third one rather than doing the second one. You get too many requests. So actually at the moment, I've kind of just put in like a 5-second delay. So waits 5 seconds, load that preview then, hopefully by then, unless you've got something with a lot of child components, actually there's no more requests coming through. And actually, I am finding on some occasions, if I look at, for instance, that page view you saw before, there's something like, I think there's a limit of 20 components on that page. So I am finding on sporadic occasions after the 5 seconds, it's still actually generating requests for all those children, unfortunately. One of the things that it doesn't currently do, which Stefan had a really good idea for actually, was in terms of actually how you detect child content item updates. So if I kind of come back out and show you, so if I go back in, actually, if I go to a previous slide, actually, I probably can demonstrate it a bit more succinctly. So the sys.entry.onsys, sdk.entry.onsys change works on the current item you're updating within the editor, right? So if I kind of go in here and go into my editor here, essentially this preview is associated to my ID of 1A, 9L, SOB, etc. If I click on one of these and make a change and hit save, well, it's a completely different content entry. This entry over here does not know the fact that one of these sub items has changed, so it doesn't actually know the fact it needs to update itself. Now, a couple of ways, I guess, the kind of obvious ways to work around this. Number one, potentially we could stick it on a poll, and every 5 seconds load a new version. Doesn't necessarily feel the most efficient. So actually the other way, than the way that Stefan suggested, was actually shoving a little refresh button essentially for the instances where that occurs. It's not necessarily the prettiest of solutions. I really want to find a way around it, but unfortunately at the moment I haven't quite figured it out in my head in terms of, well, actually, do we pull a list of the child IDs or something and, you know, poll whether the change date on those or something like that, but it's not quite there yet from that point of view. And the kind of other bits, 49 is just covered. Delaying content saving, again, as we saw, is not as smooth if you're an editor and making changes, having to wait that second or so you don't have to publish the content and potentially put it live before it's ready. And then finally, in terms of Storybook itself, now, obviously it's been fundamental for my talk here, because otherwise I wouldn't have had a talk, but essentially all we're doing is we've got an iframe, we're loading content via Storybook. And Storybook's great because it gives you a lot of functionality, like the hooks. I'm bringing data in, it works very smoothly. But ultimately, for instance, if you weren't using Storybook, or you had a full page, which is a lot more complicated than the pages I'm dealing with here, well, could you not just have an iframe, load your page in it, and then just reload the whole page? Well, absolutely, you could do that. You know, there's no reason why not. And actually then it's just using the SDK kind of event that I showed you before in terms of just bringing that through and updating it, you know. And yeah, I think that's possibly it. Sorry, I think I've gone slightly over as well, but that's kind of the end.
Thank you so much, David. I still am super into that. Like, completely. I think it's super cool.
Thank you. I will stop sharing so I don't kind of show yourself in the window. But yeah, it's been really interesting work on it, and actually it's been really kind of interesting delving deeper into how Contentful works with the extensions that you can do with that, and also in Storybook as well. It's absolutely fantastic stuff you can do that with the extensions and add-ons for that.
Yeah, I think it shows really clearly what the app framework is for, right? It's kind of customizing it to the editor's needs, and I think this is the main thing. And I think you made this I think you're on a very interesting journey where, like, yeah, works, but I want it actually to be a little bit better, to have the ideal develop or editing experience. I think that's cool, super cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's super nice. So where are you going with this? Can people find the code somewhere?
Yeah, so the code not public at the moment. I just need to do a little bit of tidying out. I need to be less of a perfectionist, to be honest, on it as well. So I need to get it out as a module. I totally
understand that public code has to look at least a little bit okay-ish. I totally get that.
Yeah, right. So I kind of want to get it as a module and then just release it to the community, and then people can just kind of have a play around and kind of make use of it, really.
I mean, I could really see that Storybook is one of these crucial things that a lot of React applications just have on board, right? So I just could see that if we just get a few people together that work on that, we all benefit, right? And it would just be so beautiful to automatically update everything. It's like, oh, there's new cool to do inline preview. Because I remember, I don't know, like 2 or 3 years ago, and I feel like not everybody understands that, is that if you do the content model properly and you map it to components, that this is just like everything comes together, right? It's like preview comes together. You could just render just this thing with this data, and they're one-to-one connected. And this is where the beauty comes in.
Yeah, definitely. And what I really like with Contentful in terms of how it's out compared to maybe one or two other CMSs is there's quite often with other CMSs, there's a focus on that UI side in terms of how the editor version works. And coming from an agency background where actually we only really care about what the end user sees, it's almost like, well, you never necessarily implement that well. And with Contentful just purely focused around content and delivering you that content, well, that's what you need generally for most of the websites. And actually, if you've got something like Storybook utilizing, being able to hook into that and the functionality is absolutely fantastic and kind of does the editor's job for you in terms of getting that preview.
Yeah, totally. So I have to press one button here because Khaled wants to see my Christmas tree. There we go. And unless there has anybody, anyone, any more questions about how to integrate that, are the slides online somewhere, David?
I'll open them up and ping them over.
Cool. Then I'm going to share that with the Contentful account, and we're going to share that in Slack, where a lot of people are hanging out anyways. And with that, thank you so much for being a part of that today.
No worries. It's been a pleasure.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Cool. So I'm going to wrap that up now. Then this was David talking about Storybook and how to, and I'm going to kick you out here so that, yeah. And I think there's a lot of possibilities here to make previewing in Contentful and React and Storybook applications way more straightforward. So if there are any questions regarding Contentful or anything, I will give the whole thing a few seconds to to put them into the chat. I'm going to address them right away. But I would really love to see some people collaborating, and maybe we can build something that works nicely in Storybook and Contentful together, because I think it's just super cool, and I actually want to have that for myself too. So David is just covering the ground here. In case you have any questions anytime, you can always hit us up. Personally, I'm Twitter addicted, so Twitter works for me too, but the DevRel team is also hanging out on Slack. You can do that too. So and if anyone wants to just hang around, if we have a few people around, and you want to find out what this Among Us game is, and you want to just give it a try, you need to have to install it on your phone or iPad or whatever you have, and then you can just get onto a spaceship with random people and get overly nervous when you have to kill some people on the board. So I very much enjoyed that. So if you want to join there, you can do that too. And with this, so either you can now join contentful.com/Slack, the monthly Hangout channel, and we're going to share the details there. And with this, I think we can call it a wrap. I really appreciate everybody who was on this call today, everybody who's watching, and we have the holiday season coming up, and I wish you then happy holidays, and we see each other in a month for the next Contentful Community Hangout. Thanks, everybody.